Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us for another conversation in our Spring 2025 series, The First 100 Days from Home to Abroad. This is the fifth in our six-part series this semester, and we are at 100 days. If it's your first time joining us tonight, welcome. If you're a repeat viewer, welcome back. We are so glad you're here. I'm Mary Bruce, Assistant Director of Public Programs at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. We are an academic and public forum dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstones of global democracy. The Institute is delighted to be presenting this series with Hopkins at Home, the Alumni in Government, Academia, Law, and Policy Community, the SNF Paideia program at the University of Pennsylvania, and the SNF Ithaca Initiative at the University of Delaware. Tonight's discussion is entitled The Executive Branch in Our Backyard, the Presidential Impact in Hopkins Home. Over the next hour, we'll discuss how presidential priorities shape local communities, from Baltimore's neighborhoods to Washington, D.C.'s corridors of power. As with all programs we host, we seek to use our time together to create a space, to exchange ideas, gain insights, and learn frameworks for meaningful civic participation, a modern agora, if you will. To that end, we actively invite you to share your comments and questions in the chat throughout the talk, and we will be lifting those up to our esteemed panelists this evening. And this includes students watching from our Homewood campus here in Baltimore. Please let us know what you're thinking. In keeping with the mission of SNF Agora, this discussion is also meant to explore multiple perspectives on these issues. So I'm thrilled to welcome our guest speakers. William Howell is the inaugural dean of the School of Government and Policy at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He's also a scholar, holding a faculty appointment in the Department of Political Science and the School of Government. He has written widely on the separation of powers and American political institutions, especially the presidency. He's currently working on research projects on the separation of powers, the institutional foundations of effective government, and emergent threats to democracy. Beth Blauer is the Vice President of Public Impact Initiatives at Johns Hopkins University, where she manages the university's extensive investments in the city of Baltimore. Before becoming Vice President, she served as the Associate Vice Provost for Public Innovation, overseeing the launch and operations of both the Bloomberg Center for Government Excellence and the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation. She is also an assistant professor at the Carey Business School. Marvin James is a special advisor to Baltimore's mayor, formerly serving as his chief of staff and campaign manager. He has played a critical role in mobilizing advocacy and volunteer outreach across the city, including to, and especially to religious communities, and his leadership on the group violence reduction strategy that lowered crime rates. A Baltimore native, he has shared his commitment to ensuring that communities have a voice in this administration. One more note before we begin. The views expressed tonight are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily reflect those of the university or event sponsors. The university is committed to the steadfast protection of free expression, which emerges from the university's time-honored role in the creation of knowledge and the exploration of ideas. There's a lot of wonderful information about how we're living that up every day at expression.jhu.edu. We'll share that link in the chat, and we also invite you to share your questions and ideas in the chat as well. So with that, I would love to turn it to the panelists, starting with you, Ms. Blauer. We wanted to host this discussion on the executive branch in our backyard because executive transitions on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Can feel sometimes far away from Main Street, or maybe in this case, Pennsylvania Avenue in West Baltimore. Could you share more about the impact the federal government has on cities, and especially during times of a presidential transition in the White House?
Yeah, thank you, Mary, so much. And thank you to Dean Howell and Marvin for being here. This is a really exciting and important conversation to have. And my role here at the top is really just to sort of set the table and talk a little bit about how cities and the relationship to the federal government interact, but with a little bit of a caveat that during every presidential transition, things change. Programs are spun up, programs are taken offline, things slow down in certain instances. And that is something that we expect as city leaders, that during transitions, there will be shifting priorities and that those priorities may or may not align to the prior administration. And so we may see certain shifts or changes. Um, I think it's fair to say that none of us have seen anything that has changed as much as it has in the last 100 days. And so this is just a very fast-paced change. And we're seeing lots of changes that are happening all across, not just in terms of changes in prioritization and programming, but also in the makeup of the public workforce, what it looks like to be working for the federal government, and obviously what it looks like to be the recipient of funding from the federal government across a broad host of things. But what I'm going to focus on now is just cities. Cities are essentially the front lines of what are well-worn paths from the federal government into local communities across almost every area that you think when you think about government. So when you're thinking about government in terms of the benefit of having a federal government like we do in this country, you may think of your Social Security. You may think of the fact that you are paying income taxes or that you have a job with the federal government. So there are really sort of broad ways in which we're transacting with the federal government all the time in cities. But some of the ways we may not always think about is that also the federal government deeply subsidizes many of our health insurance. So people that rely on public health insurance, whether that's because you're retired and you're using one of the time-honored Medicare and Medicaid programs for your particular health needs, or whether you're utilizing healthcare that you've received in exchange at a lower rate so that you're getting a sort of subsidized healthcare because you are either unemployed or underemployed. We rely on the federal government for our healthcare. We rely on the federal government for helping us rebuild bridges. So we know that we had a tragedy here in our own city where we lost a bridge last year. And the federal government is a partner in rebuilding the Key Bridge. They're also a partner in maintaining our highways, in growing our physical infrastructure, making sure that our bridges are safe, making sure that our infrastructure is safe, making sure that our roads are paved, that our systems are intact. And that's not just our roadways, that's also our public transit. Our public transit is also deeply subsidized by grants that we receive from the federal government. Our schools rely heavily on federal funding. We have federal funding that subsidizes our core curriculum, but also if your child eats lunch at school, that's a program of the Department of Agriculture or as part of the federal government. And so the Department of Agriculture also has in places like Baltimore where they provide free lunch for all students. And oftentimes that includes free breakfast and sometimes a supper meal. And for some of our children, that's the place where they eat. They get their food from their school, and that's how we fight off childhood hunger. We have the federal government that subsidizes utilities. So if you are having difficulty making ends meet, there's a social safety net that allows you to access temporary cash, that allows you to, there are all kinds of different programs. And where this plays out is in cities. Cities are the place where these programs are administered. We have people who work in our transportation offices, in our housing offices, in our social safety net offices. Some of them are city employees and some of them are federal employees, but they all live within the bounds of our cities. They're operating within the bounds of our cities, and we deeply rely on the federal government for almost every sort of quality of life thing you can think about that happens in a city. And so when we're talking about shifting priorities, or we're talking about what's happening now when these funds are frozen, when these programs change or rapidly scale up or scale down, they're going to have big cascading impacts on our ability to meet basic needs. So we may not be able to provide free or reduced lunch, or we may not be able to deploy resources into a particular community because they either have not released those funds or we haven't gotten access to that money. And so those are the kinds of things that we're seeing. We have an ecosystem of nonprofit partners that power a lot of work that happens across our city. They are also delivery partners in a lot of education support, in a lot of community planning support. They think about how we utilize our parks, how we think about delivering after-school services to our kids, how we think about designing our communities. And those, again, are deeply subsidized by this long-standing relationship that we've had with the federal government. And then there's us, Johns Hopkins University. We're the largest research institution in the country. We have enjoyed a very deep bond with the federal government that really gets to the root of our covenant with the people of our country and the world, in which we endeavor lots of research that is life-saving, that has big impacts, whether you're a cancer patient and you're receiving an experimental medicine because we're exploring a new option, or you're doing other life-saving research around how you get from point A to point B in your vehicle safely, whatever that may be. We are the recipient of a lot of funding that is shifting, and we're seeing changes, dramatic changes, including some of the most impacts that we've seen around our international work. And so there is a lot of impacts just here in Baltimore City because we are anchored here. We are the largest employer in the state, and specifically in the city. And we also have more than 12,000 federal workers who now live in Baltimore. And these are all kinds of things. We have federal agencies all over the country that employ people. And so what we're seeing now is also just a general shift in employment, a general shift in kind of what skills are now available for hiring into other places. And so cities are having to sort of mobilize, sort of meet this moment. So these changes are having a deep impact on our people, on our systems, and on the way that we sort of are thinking about advancing ourselves as a system or as a city.
Thank you so much, Beth. I am not currently enrolled in any classes or a student, but I'm taking lots and lots of notes. I love how I really appreciate how you're articulating this as a multidimensional relationship, that it's not one way necessarily, but there's a whole network of players. And you use language around the covenant, like what are the relationships and formal and informal contracts and relationships that help every day, every one of us live out our lives. I'm sure Professor Howell has a lot to say about this and has certainly written a lot of brilliance about this. Your new book, Trajectory of Power, Professor Howell, is about the strongman presidency and the accumulation of power in the presidency. I'd love to hear from you as a scholar of the American political institutions, especially the presidency. What are you seeing? How are you understanding it? What should we know? And we will put a link to that new book in the chat as well.
Well, thank you. What a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Mary, and with Marvin and Beth at this extraordinary moment in our nation's history. And I thought I would take a little bit of time to characterize the politics that are playing out at the national level with an eye towards trying to clarify what's new and what's different. There's so much happening. This is an unbelievably volatile time. Not everything, though, is being made up for the first time. There are some through lines when we think about the politics of presidential power that are worth identifying, but also some important distinctions when we think about the Trump presidency and these 100 days in particular. And a place to start, to my mind, is to recognize that when we talk about the significance of the 100-day mark, that's harkens back to FDR and his first 100 days in office that was filled with all kinds of efforts to pass new legislation. This was an effort to create policies meant to address a domestic economic crisis that was driven in large part through Congress. And that's not what we're seeing right now. This is not a story of ambitious legislative proposals being put before Congress and a president touring the country making the case for their adoption. This is instead a story about presidents acting unilaterally in issuing executive orders and memoranda, all kinds of directives that are intended to unilaterally change all manner of policy. And many, many, many of these policies have impacts on cities for the reasons that Beth outlined. This is a different kind of politics. And it's something I've written about. My first book was called Power Without Persuasion. in which I tried to make sense of what these politics look like. And there are politics that are enjoined by Democrats and Republicans alike, liberals and conservatives alike. And with that in mind, it's worth then seeing how these politics in some ways are the same and in some ways are very different under Trump. So let me just say a little bit about each, how they carry through. The first thing to note is that these directives are used and have long been used to pass all manner of important policy, both domestic and foreign in nature. Trump isn't making these things up. These were on the table, available to him to pick up and deploy. And there's a long, long history of presidents doing these things for conservative and liberal purposes alike. He isn't making them up anew. It also isn't true, and Beth pointed towards this in her own comments. It isn't new for a president to step in and deploy these unilateral directives in the service of amending or overturning the actions of they've all been his, predecessors, particularly when the predecessor was from the opposite party. We see policy lurching to the left and to the right through the use of these unilateral powers as Democrats and Republicans assume the White House. So that isn't new to the fact that he's overturning all kinds of things that Biden did. Well, Biden overturned a whole lot of things that Trump did. And Trump, when he first assumed office in 2017, overturned a whole lot of things that Obama did. These are the way of things. It's also worth noting these politics remain at their core a politics of what presidents can get away with and not about who they can bring along. This is not a politics of broad coalition building, of arguing and persuading to try to build a mass base of support. These are a politics where you sort of push outwards a particular directive and you see if they land. And if they do land and neither Congress nor the courts can get it together to subsequently overturn them, well, then that's a win for the president. So, and there too, we see these politics playing out. And there are politics too, this is the last point I'll make as it relates to continuities, wherein legislative gridlock serves as the backdrop to unilateral activity. It's when Congress is dysfunctional or stuck that presidents routinely have incentives to then deploy these unilateral directives. They have incentives to do so insofar as the introduction of proposals to Congress aren't going to get anywhere when they can't get anywhere because the majorities are bare majorities in the House and the Senate, that then presidents say, well, if I can't pass it legislatively, I might act unilaterally instead. They also have reason to do so because precisely because it's difficult during periods of legislative gridlock for Congress to pass the president's agenda, so too is it difficult for Congress in the aftermath of a unilateral directive being issued by the president to get their act together to amend it or to overturn it. So the inability of Congress to act creates an incentive on the front end for them to do so, and then creates an incentive too on the back end insofar as the check that Congress might place on the exercise of unilateral powers slackens a bit, which creates an opportunity for them to exercise these powers. So the fact that Congress isn't doing much now, to me, is no great surprise. This is routinely when presidents exercise these powers to considerable effect. Continuity, 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 continuity. It's not all, though, a story about continuities. And I want to just underscore two, to my mind, big differences which contribute to the volatility and the unpredictability and the disturbance that, again, has all these implications for cities that Beth was pointing our attention to. The first is that when thinking about how presidents exercise these powers, the usual calculus that they undertake is to say, well, how far can I push them, right? How far can I push outwards on the boundaries of my powers and get away with it? And they think strategically about how far they can go, and they routinely try to go right up to the edge, but no farther. They want to avoid a judicial or legislative rebuke, because in a judicial or legislative rebuke, what happens is first there's a policy loss as policy reverts back to whatever the previous status quo was. That's a loss to the president. And then the other thing is that to the extent that there is a rebuke, then the next day on the front page is a story that says big loss to the president, and they would just as soon avoid that. That's not what we're seeing right now at all. What we're seeing right now is a president who is issuing extraordinary claims that vastly exceed conventional notions of what the boundaries of presidential power are. This is a story where claims are being made, not just about how they can unilaterally overturn laws, but overturn provisions of the Constitution having to do with birthright citizenship, whether or not you can serve a third term. These are claims that are truly extraordinary. And he's doing so with abandon. And what we're then seeing is the court stepping in again and again. It has yet to see the extent to which the judiciary is going to represent a real check on the president, but stepping in again and again, overturning different actions that the president is making. This is new. This is not something we're accustomed to seeing. Both the just how far-reaching the claims are, and then how quickly there have been so many judicial reversals early on. We can spend some time later on trying to unpack why this is happening, but I just want to underscore that's different. That's new. One last thing, and then I'll stand down, which is the relationship between policy and power, which I think is very different underneath this president. I'm accustomed to thinking about, as somebody who's studied presidential power for a long time, of thinking about presidents' appetite for power is one that's instrumental in nature. They care about power not because they like it per se, but because it serves ends, and those ends typically have policy content. And what they want to do is change domestic policy in one way or another, but they operate in a system that constitutionally is very hard to navigate. And so they then lay claim to power that allows them to pass policy, to push policy out. It's not about the power per se, it's about what the power accomplishes that is really driving the president's effort to expand the boundaries of their power. I think that's, in broad measure, the story of, in the modern era, how presidents have approached power for a long time. Here, I don't think it's quite so clear, because I think there are a number of domains where we can think about the policy as being a kind of staging ground for claims to new kinds of power, and changing the relationship that the president has, the power relationship that presidents has with other actors. It's not altogether clear that the story, for instance, of internationally tariffs is one where that Trump has a new way of thinking about the value of tariffs in terms of trade per se, so much as it is with changing the relationship, not just between the United States and other countries, but the presidents play a relationship with other countries. Likewise, and I'll end with this, as it relates to the president's relationship to universities, that yes, there is a concern that's been articulated as it relates to anti-Semitism, DEI concerns, but in an important way, what also is being played out is just a changing structural relationship between where universities sit in relationship to the federal government. And that has very much to do with the initial foray being about, sure, policy and real concerns about policy, but in a deeper way, a restructuring of power relationships.
Thank you so much. I have to both say I'm heartened because I know my brain is getting smarter listening, but my blood pressure is also going up because I know both you and the previous speaker, Ms. Blauer, talked about the impact on real people. I heard you build on some of her themes too, or your themes complementing each other around the relationships here. That what's new. What's not different is presidents try to accumulate more power. That happens in lots of places and lots of times. But what's different here is the unilateral relationship, the unilateral direction of some of these decisions. In some of our previous conversations, we've talked about the relationship between the branches of government, and I'm excited here to continue to dig in the relationship from federal executive to city executive. So I'm going to turn now to a question for Mr. James. First by saying, I just moved to Baltimore and I've wanted to move here for a long time. So I'm so excited to be a part of the city and live where I work. And I saw you nodding. I'm not sure if you were on camera for those at home, but I saw you nodding during a lot of what your colleagues have shared. So my question for you is, what does this mean for Baltimore? The old saying is all politics is local. Is that true? Is that true now? And what is playing out during a presidential transition for city government, for city residents, and all of the stakeholders you're working with, from community members and active city council? I see you're deep in thought. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, and both to Professor Howell and Beth being on this panel. I first want to start off with immediately responding to yes, absolutely. All politics are always local. Our cities and counties and municipalities are always kind of like our front lines into how people perceive government. While, of course, there are all of the different branches and, of course, the different levels of local and state and federal, absolutely, the everyday person perceives government oftentimes through their local. Through their local government. I want to start off by saying that particularly the Scott administration, and I would like to kind of like recall for the panel, but also for the viewers at home, that this was not our first rodeo with the Trump administration. When we came in, we were coming into kind of like his final term in last year. And then, of course, we had our transition into the Biden administration and then our transition back into to the current administration. And I think what I want to help kind of set the stage overall for everyone is understanding that while we absolutely had that level of experience for the first 4 years with the Trump administration, I think that the breadth and the way in which the Trump administration has been kind of coming into this space concerning how they deliver policy at how the pace in which they deliver policy has been absolutely distinctly different, right? And so because of that, it has caused for what a lot of local governments perceived early what the Trump administration would do. They probably were preparing themselves for, just not at the level of pace in which they are doing it. And so I'll take you back to the day of when the flood of executive orders started, right? And I want to kind of put it in real time and what that looked like for just your kind of average day local administration. Whereas in we received a call, right, from one of our constituents who were in the city, took a 2.5 hour bus ride to a doctor's appointment, got to the doctor's appointment, and was told by their doctor that they would not be able to be seen because they could not log into the Medicaid portal. So I just want us to like just think about that as a very fierce example about from an older adult who was already on a bus and had to take several buses to get to their doctor, right? Then get to the doctor and was unable to participate in that level of care just because of what was a flood. We haven't even talked about whether or not, right, policy actually being initiated, right, the actual execution of how it would be initiated. We were just talking about to what Professor Howe was talking earlier about the extent of presidential powers and to how far it can go, and also the power, right, of the bully pulpit. And at that time, the kind of frustration and confusion and direction seeking that business partners were looking for, government partners were looking for, that an everyday citizen was looking for, and how it can have those ripple effects. And at the center of that example is what I want everyone to kind of like come into the understanding when we talk about all politics are local is about in which way people receive their everyday items, goods, right, and more importantly, services. And to what Beth was talking about earlier, is that sincerely, we really, as the local government, we act as frontline partners to the federal government to be able to do all of those services and goods. And so, while of course, we might be the people who are delivering, whether it be through nonprofit partners, whether it be as a pass through to our older adults to do Meals on Wheels, right? That money comes from the federal government, right? And so, it is a kind of a stark example of how what we do oftentimes. People don't know that they probably like their government sleepy, but right here, what they've seen is an activation like never before, and how it will daily impact their lives. And so, we, particularly in the administration, one of the things that we had to do immediately was, how is this going to impact our budget, right? How are we going to be able to provide critical services because of what we believe are either going to be massive cuts or just strict eliminations of programs, right? And again, it is the ripple effect, right? It is the ripple effect that can often cause the harm. That while your citizen to your neighbor to your left or to your right say, well, I don't know if this exactly affects me, right? I don't, I haven't seen it affect me yet, right? And oftentimes we have to help people understand that this is the reason of why and how we do community, and why I'm so steadfast in being able to make sure that citizens across the city have the ability to be able to have input into what these things look like, right? And so while you might not be affected, your neighbor, who might be a federal worker, your neighbor who might be depending on Head Start, your neighbor who might be, looking for that next grant to be able to do and service, right, community and or in health. All of those things come together and they impact in some way, and oftentimes have a larger effect that takes time for people to see. But if we are not operating in alignment and or at best, right, a understanding of how those impacts will happen over time, sincerely can cause great damage to our everyday life, particularly at the local level. I will end with this, which is saying that again, local governments are no stranger to changes in government. We have been doing it since the existence of like time, and that the government has been in existence. We prepare ourselves fully understanding that change absolutely will happen, whether it is Democrat, whether it is Republican. We are always prepared for that. I think what you are seeing at municipalities and cities across the country are people who are now having to make very hard choices about how do we service our constituents day in, day out without having the necessary information or the necessary pace or protocol that we're used to in being able to make those decisions. And, I think what you'll see throughout this conversation is this consistent theme of how are we being able how are we able to pull ourselves together to be able to make sure that we're able to serve, protect, right, our community members every day.
Can I ask a question of you, Marvin?
Yes.
Because I think one of the things that we're struck by with this present administration, it isn't just the speed of the directives that are being handed down or how extreme they are relative to previous commitments. It's also just the uncertainty. You said we don't have the information, the uncertainty of it. The orders are being coming down in the middle of the night and they're ambiguous, and then they're being retracted and then reissued in different ways, which I have to imagine makes it incredibly difficult at a local level to figure out how to adapt. If you just knew that the cuts were going to happen full stop, you'd say that's hard, but let's set to work. But so much of this just feels like it's in flux.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Professor Howell. And again, that first day when we had our flurry of like executive orders from the White House, I want you to imagine we're already running a city, right? That means that right every day we wake up with something on fire, right? So we don't know what is going to be the fire of the day, right? But there is something that we as the administration have to work through. You get an executive order that says, hey, we're going to be cutting X amount of dollars from health, right? That means that immediately we are pulling our staffs together, right? That is man hours that are now taken away from what would have been our regular schedules to be able to respond to an issue that we don't even know whether or not, because I want to remind you that by the end of the day, the administration, the president and the administration had retracted what was the order because of what was the political fallout that he was receiving from both sides of the aisle. And so we spent all day doing a tabletop exercise trying to figure out how do we service right our day-to-day health services, knowing that we had this cut that at that time sounded like it was going to be immediate, right? And so you're absolutely right. That is again the ripple effect. And now something has been taken away, right? Time has been taken away from another critical service that someone somewhere has been looking. It's been on a calendar for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks to be able to get executed on. And it's now just been pushed back because of a whim and maybe a prayer to be able to say this is what I wanted to do. And so you really do speak eloquently when we talk about about how far in extension do we see these powers tested. And so yes, exactly, absolutely correct.
Thank you so much for that question, Professor Howell, and thank you, Mr. James, for the remarks. And you talked about being frontline partners to the federal government, and as you continued to speak, I heard it as frontline partners to each other. The government is we the people. I work at a democracy center, and I think sometimes the language can feel a little far away, but like democracy for me, the democracy is like the everydayness of crossing the street, helping my neighbor who can my mom, hi mom, my mom's on the call today. Hi mom. Like my mom had her social security check didn't come on time and like she had to navigate through that. And so it's the real, that's the beauty of democracy. That's the beauty of people really. And anywhere in any system is how we're helping each other out.
Yeah, there's actually a question that came in through the chat around, what is the who's coming to the rescue, whether or not we're going to have local philanthropy or private, first of all, and I want to kind of call into question sort of what you're getting at, which is, should we be racing back to restore some status quo? Like, I think that the answer to that is also no. The answer to that is that the American people voted and elected this president because they too were really frustrated that they were paying an exorbitant amount of money for services that were not always delivered effectively, that were not meeting their needs. They were still not realizing the American dream in the way that it had been depicted to them. And so there is something fundamentally interesting about this time, because while we're seeing this, limit really be pushed, it's not because there isn't some legitimacy to the need to have change. And so I want to make sure that we're centering this conversation around, we're not racing back to try to restore kind of what has been lost, but it's also kind of what comes next, right? We can, spend a lot of time thinking about how to kind of break down what was in place before and how we're really kind of tearing down a lot of infrastructure throughout government and throughout all of our shared systems. But what rises up out of that is the big question. And I think that that's getting to kind of what Marvin is saying, which is that we don't know. And there doesn't seem to be that kind of very clear path. But, I also think that to think that the question isn't should the private interest or should family philanthropy sort of come in and backfill to try to restore some status quo programming. There's lots of reasons why we don't want that. It's not just because there isn't enough resource. It's also because there are safeguards in place in the compact between higher education and the federal government, in the compact between cities and states and the federal government, that protect people. And we protect people from special interest and from making sure that we're equitably distributing, the opportunity to access sort of core basic resources, or that we're growing in smart ways that are deeply efficient, but that are also effective and that are going to create longer, healthier lives. That these are things that we don't necessarily want the pharmaceutical companies sort of taking over the sort of the research arm of medicine, so that, we are then uncertain of the kind of legitimacy in the way that we've tested those drugs, or the way that we have researched their efficacy and the people that they are. But the same thing goes with road safety, and the same thing goes with the way that we think about AI and regulatory frameworks that will protect us from certain things. There are all kinds of things in which we really do need government to help us maintain that compact, that sort of autonomy of thought, and that autonomy of research. And those standards are really important. And so I think it's important for us to also ask that question is, how are we going to keep that compact intact as we also think about this big dramatic change that we're seeing, which in part is being driven by the demands of the voting population in this country. And I just want to make sure that we're being clear that the answer isn't quickly to try to undo this. It's really to understand, how do we move on from this period in time with some of these, I think, pretty essential pieces still intact.
Yeah, and Mary, I don't want to, clearly, I don't know if you have questions that we need to get through, but I actually would love to to extend from what Beth is talking about, which is she made a really, really important point, which is, one of the things that there's been a large conversation about within the party in which, I belong to, which is about, how do we go back, right? How do we establish, right, this kind of like order that makes everyone feel comfortable? And I think that one of the things that what we are seeing, even for those who did not particularly vote for the current administration, what we are seeing is people who are open to now kind of like understanding, wait a minute, I didn't know that the federal government did that. I I didn't know that the services in which they, I didn't know that the money went to this. I didn't even know that this existed, right? And so I think you do have a willingness now for people who are looking for, how do we figure out what is next, right? And more importantly, how do we either improve on it, right? And or right, how do we make sure that moving forward, we're not locked into the idea of kind of like waste, right? Because that's essentially what you're seeing with the with Dodge and Doge and all of these other entities that are connected, right, to the administration. People want efficiency, right? They want to be able to believe that their government is working for them, right? And I think that one of the things that we will do ourselves disservice, particularly for those who are on this side of the aisle, is locking ourselves into believing that we don't get to listen to those voters or to those persons, right? I think that there is, regardless of what their reasoning was, for voting for the current administration, I think that there is a very real responsibility for us to be able to make sure that we don't shut off our ears, right, to what they voted for, and essentially how can we be able to speak truth to power and what they're actually looking for, regardless of whatever the plethora of issues that they made a decision to for voting in this current administration.
I guess I'd say that I agree with this, that There's greater clarity to be found in the critique that the present administration offers than in the vision about where things need to go. That there's a repudiation of past trade deals, a repudiation of excessively liberal universities, a repudiation of the waste and ineffectiveness of big D democratic rule in major American cities, that kind of thing, right? That's the repudiation. But to articulate clearly what powers used to be in service of, what previous institutional arrangements that need to be not just disrupted, but made anew. That kind of vision is harder to discern. Right now, it feels like we're amidst the disruption and the chaos, and again, the repudiation. But when you then, to my mind, when you have cities, yes, but also major industries, states, trying to say, all right, how do I shift? Where am I meant to go? It's awfully hard to see where there's space for really constructive engagement and the building of new institutional orders. It's because those need to be built. It's not just about a politics of recovery. It can't just be, I mean, it can be, but this would be a mistake, I think, in all of our views, that if all we do is like hunker down and say, let us get through this, there are deep, real reasons why the public called for this repudiation. But what is it in the service of precisely? I think that remains very much an open question.
And how are we defining the sort of next generation of the American dream?
Yeah.
Because it is the narrative of the American dream that has kind of gotten us to this point. And so if that's how we ended up here, does it need to be reimagined? And does it need to be sort of fundamentally endorsed? And I think that question is still very open, and it's not one that we've heard. It's
So
not
much is in flux.
Yeah, too
That's
much
right.
is in
I mean, it's
flux.
about power, it's about relationships, federal,
Right.
state. It
But
also
for
is
who,
about
right?
how
Like,
we
in the
understand
service of what?
ourselves. Yeah.
Right. And I think
Sure.
eventually we're going to have to get to the point of who is this all in service to? Because what motivated the beginning of this was this notion that we have left too many people behind in the pathways to the American dream, whether that's higher education, whether that's our systems, whether that's the way that we think about education writ large. But now we're sort of getting to the point where we now have to say, okay, well, we've seen what, the levers pulled. Now we need to sort of do that reimagining piece. And, it'll be really interesting to see kind of what stakeholders are part of the thought leadership around the reimagining. Because we're seeing that also shifting dramatically in the administration. The president, is leaning on a certain skill set to do this first review. But who knows what comes next? And I think that that's an open question that is really top of mind for many people, but especially for mayors across the country, as they start to think about how they have to kind of reimagine their own thinking in cities, or whether they're governors in states, and across the whole array that has been very much tied to the current iteration of that American dream.
I'm so grateful and humbled to be a part of this conversation, and I see a lot of great questions coming in. And I'm wondering, with only 10 minutes remaining, as you're talking about painting this new picture of what's to come, but also this like longer term vision, what are we building towards? But there's also this very real short term, how are cities meeting critical needs when funds are being cut? How are universities managing that? I'm wondering if each of you could speak to a little more like day-to-dayness. What are some of the initiatives that are going on? How are you managing the short-term response with the long-term planning? And
Yeah,
no one's
sure.
making, start
Yeah,
with
sure.
you.
Yeah,
Great.
sure. I think that I will use one that, like, we are making sure that collectively is a part of kind of like just the public health experience here, right? We have we've received notice, about possible cuts to HIV and STI testing, right, in Baltimore City. This is a very real public health right? Service that every major city, but also particularly one that is unique to Baltimore City as a majority African American city, right? That we want to always be able to make sure that we are providing. It is causing right administrations. It is causing mayors across the city to be able to number one take stock of what is truly important. So I want to kind of like extend that back to kind of like what Beth and Professor Howell was just talking about and lifting up, right? But really about how a consciousness to how it is causing administrations, but causing people to really laser in to what is
Mm.
a super priority, right, for the day to day. That is extremely important, right? We have worked extremely hard, not just on HIV and STI testing, but the opioid epidemic in Baltimore, right? Being able to make sure that we're able to provide services day in, day out, extremely critical to saving lives in a city that has struggled tremendously, right, with drug overdosing. There's not a person, and I say this a lot when it comes to current overdosing, about like, there's, we have those stories because those are our family members, those are our uncles, our aunts who have gone through that level of crisis. All of that to be said, that it has caused us, right, to then put a lot of energy to us saying, hey, this is an extreme priority of ours. And of course, again, to every administration, there are always cuts, there are always refocusing. But like sincerely, that is what this current administration is causing us, and the wave in which they're doing it is causing us to just prioritize where we should be putting our energy, if and should when the cuts come, and if they are coming.
I hear you say there are like two strains to this. One is really about a a clarity of purpose and a focusing on essentials that's born of all of what's happening. But there are other moments where you have wasted days, where like orders are being handed down, you're trying to attend to that, and then you're thrown off balance, and that's not constructive time. That's just like you're left in a kind of in a stupor
Yeah.
by virtue of the frenetic kind of directives that are being handed down and then retracted and then handed down once again, which
Yeah.
is a strange space to be, to have both of those things.
Yeah, and it is the unique nature of I am not here to proclaim what is the reasoning, right, for the White House and for why they are doing this. Here's what I can tell you that is a very real response from chief of staffs across the city, right? That oftentimes that this exercise feels like the intent is to cause, right, the tiring out, the unique nature of what already is stressful jobs, that of layering that additional level of stress, as you're already trying to make really important decisions day in and day out for people. And oftentimes the people that there's a good quote that talks about that normally you will work and live in a city that is within kind of like 90 or 120 miles. I can't remember exactly what that is, but oftentimes, right, like for a legacy city like Baltimore, the majority of the people that work in this city are from here, right? They have lived here, they've been here, right? And so these are all people that you love, and you do this work out of service, right? You do it for others. And so the administration, and in its way in which they are doing this work, often does cause for people to be like, I don't know whether or not I want to. Do I want to put up with this? Do I want, do I want to do this work? But you try to charge everyone to keep a north star of why you're doing work. I hope, Mary, that example kind of answered your question as well.
It's wonderful. It's really, really illuminating. And I'm wondering, I know we're coming up on time quickly here, but Beth, I wonder if you could share a little bit about what Hopkins is doing right now in this moment, and then we'll turn to you, Dean Howell, as well.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
we're trying to also figure out what's happening and to respond. And we've had, again, to lay off, a lot of people, particularly in our international programs, but a lot of them called Baltimore home base. And a lot of them will continue, hopefully, to call Baltimore home base. I think we're going to see more of that, but we're also trying to understand, what does it mean to employees that work for the federal government that no longer will work for the federal government. We have a number of employees that work in our anchor campuses here at Social Security, at CMS, at IRS. They all have a significant workforce that not just comes to Baltimore every day for work, but also lives in Baltimore. And oftentimes, even if they're not living in Baltimore, they're shopping in our shops and they're eating in our restaurants and they are enjoying all of the amazing beauty and wonder that Baltimore has to offer. And so we're trying to figure out how Hopkins as a platform can come meet this moment, whether that's helping. I know the city is hiring people, so how can we get the federal workforce that may have skills that maybe that the city would be able to pick some folks up, and are there opportunities to make connections? And so we're trying to think through that. But we're also trying to figure out from our own perspective, and we talked a little bit yesterday in a message from our leadership institutionally, that we're also trying to figure out how to save the life-saving research that we do here on campus. When we say research saves lives, research literally saves lives, whether that's our medical research, whether that's our technology research and engineering, all of it together in an aggregate is designed purposefully to improve lives, to make lives better, to push us, very much in line with this notion of American exceptionalism that I think we still hold very true. And so how do we do that? Well, we're going to have to figure out what levers are available to us, whether that is being creative about how we fund research that's been cut midway through completion. We have doctoral students that are working in their postdoctoral research or in their doctoral research that are going to have to get some relief because their funds have been cut, or whether that's in our medical research or in any of our work that we're doing. So we're trying to figure out what are the levers that we have in a way that will allow us to continue to live into that mission of our research being important, being central to saving lives, but also in service to this compact that we have with the federal government, in which we really are sort of the R&D arm of the federal government. And we want to maintain that because it's not just good for Hopkins institutionally or for Baltimore, it's good for people across the country and the globe. Being able to have us with a high standard around the way that we think about research is really important. And so we're going to continue to preserve that academic autonomy so that we can advance our research mission and continue our life-saving work.
That's brilliant, and I am all in. Dean Howell, from your you've shared from your role as a professor, any final words on as the dean of a new school with a DC footprint?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go after Beth. Like, that was amazing. Like, that's where we should end. It was exactly right. Like, there are big stakes involved with these commitments to research. A lot of important for life-saving work, engagement with cities. I'm standing up a brand new school in partnership with Beth and Marvin. We got to talk. That is thinking anew about how Hopkins can be engaged in this world, contribute to democracy, train people who I hope will work in the Baltimores of the United States, and taking a hard look to Beth's earlier point about this isn't just about preserving that which was, taking a hard look at ways that universities have failed and to try to stand up a new institution that succeeds when it comes to things like viewpoint diversity, like doing impactful public-facing work through partnership. All that's true, and it's embedded in this vision that Beth just laid out that is so essential as we move forward in a troubled time, but also a time where there are pockets of opportunity. And part of the challenge for us is to identify those pockets of opportunity and put them to good use.
Thank you so much. We are coming up on time before I give all of the thanks to the panelists and everyone at home. Panelists, any final words?
No, I just want to thank you for this conversation. I think that it was extremely important. I hope that the viewers at home, received it in the way in its intention. But again, if I leave you with nothing else, continue to look for the opportunity to be able to serve your neighbor, to be able to serve your city. All is not lost, right? There is so much to look forward to. We've got some troubled days ahead, but the days of hope ahead of us are so much more.
And just one point of clarification to Dean Howell's last point: there are no other cities like Baltimore. So we are coming to you from the greatest city in America, and make no bones about it. I just want to make sure that that's very clear. Thank
Absolutely,
you.
100%.
Love it. To everyone tuning in at home, I said at the beginning, we're co-creating this space together. Thank you for your questions. Time is a precious and non-renewable resource. Thank you for spending it with us. Please, we're dropping a quick survey in the chat. We'll also email it out. Please, it's 1 minute and it helps us shape up conversations like these. We're actively planning what's next, so let us know what you want to hear more of. I'd like to hear more from all of these speakers. And we have one more event in this series, actually this Thursday on May 1st. Where we're looking at civic engagement. So you queued it up quite nicely with that call to action, that call to service. We'll be looking at how civic engagement can build a new resilience in American democracy with former Congressman John Sarbanes, the head of the CSC here, Jasmine Blank Jones, and a local nonprofit partner. So that is going to be offering some very specific ways to get involved. Again, on behalf of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, thank you so much, Dean Howell, Ms. Blauer, Mr. James, all of your teams that make this work happen, everybody at home. We together are advancing the SNF Agora mission, and I think all of our mission to create stronger, healthier global democracies, to bring together people across dialogue, and talk about the values and ideas that form the foundation of a pluralistic democracy. We're all taking care of each other. That's the good work. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.